thank you very much. You may not actually believe this, but I don't think I've ever given a lecture to an audience this size before. Usually it's like 10 people, 15 people, something like that. So if I end up looking very nervous up here, you'll understand why as I look out over all the faces. But thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. I've been to DC many times, but I somehow never made it beyond the DC border into Maryland to see the institution here. But it's an area I have very fond memories of. So it's really a pleasure to be back and to see a part of the area that I've never actually ever seen before on the campus here. So let me first give you a little bit of background information on where what I'm going to be speaking about today comes from a book that I'm writing right now, but it's not actually that book. And I just realized that if I call this talk a short history of sketching in Japan, that might actually mean nothing to anybody. But it probably calls up an image in your mind of images. But in fact, it does mean that in Japanese, but it generally means words. So I'll actually be talking primarily about language, but language inspired by visuality. And I began grappling with the literature on sketching as part of a book project that I have the manuscript for right now, which is about a totally different topic. It's about social mobility in the Japanese novel. And that project required only a very limited engagement with sketching as part of one chapter, an analysis of Japanese naturalism, which made heavy use of the technique. But like all of these investigations that start out by trying to supplement one part of a chapter, it ends up looking like it's very interesting material and may potentially be a kind of book or a project in and of itself. So what I want to speak to you today about is this topic of sketching, and it's sort of my first attempt to see if this project is kind of a viable long-term project. And so I should say it's quite provisional at the moment, and I have not done any of the requisite research in, for example, the European sources, although we'll talk about some European painters today. I've not done research in the Japanese visual sources, so I'm sticking primarily to Japanese literary figures. And so I'll call it, I guess just to distinguish it so it doesn't call up the wrong image in your mind, I'll call it literary sketching to kind of highlight that I'm dealing mostly with words today and not images. So regardless of what might be happening in Europe at the time, and Europe is one of the sources for this idea of sketching, sketching was borrowed for very specific domestic purposes in Japan. And this context, I think, is best brought to light by examining how Japanese writers talk about sketching. So I'm not actually today dealing with literary works per se, I'm dealing with a discourse on sketching in Japan, a discourse on literary sketching, how writers talk about this technique that they're importing from the European visual arts. So hopefully some of what I discussed today hopefully there are some people in the room who are actually knowledgeable about the European visual arts, because I would love to hear more about them and try and make connections. To make the connections I'll be drawing out stronger. My approach will be, I'll be dealing with some very well-known names in Japanese literature, Masaoka Shiki, Shimazaki Toson, and so on, but I will actually be working with less well-known essays and prose pieces of theirs. So what follows is, perhaps we could call it a sketch of literary sketching in Japan around the turn of the last century. And the focus, the thread connecting everything, will be the representation of nature, and in particular, the representation of clouds. So clouds is sort of our keyword today. So I know I don't have a strong sense of how many people in this room speak Japanese, so I listed some of the terms that may not be familiar to everyone up here. Stepping back for a moment in order to take in a broader view, nature has been, for about 2 decades now, a privileged topic in discussions of representation in modern Japanese literature, and in particular of the development of the modern Japanese novel. This hasn't always been the case. For decades before that, nearly exclusive focus had fallen on twin issues: the techniques for representing interiority of characters, and the development of a vernacular literary language with which to describe that. That vernacular literary language is, in Japanese, generally called genbun ichi up here, which literally means the unification of speech and writing. So we have then, for a long time, up until fairly recently then, the preoccupation with interiority and language in discussions of the development of Japanese fiction and the Japanese novel. And it's easy to see why. For these two features were seen as the most important components of the modern European novel, so critics were looking for their appearance in modern Japanese fiction, and they were essentially using them as benchmarks to judge the modernity of the Japanese novel, the sort of the progress that it was making. So in this story, writers are attempting to domesticate the European novel with its intense depiction of psychology, developed a vernacular literary language for the purposes of verisimilitude. The key figures in this first story, as I'll call it, are listed right up here. Tsubochi Shoyo, who's probably, although he's mostly a theater critic, he's actually probably best well known for his treatise on the modern novel. And Futabate Shime, who knew Shoyo quite well and who is said to have been the first person to implement Shoyo's techniques or recommendations. And then finally, all of this is inherited by Japanese naturalism at the turn of the century, who are said to have brought these techniques to maturity in Japan. One can find this version of the rise of the modern novel in Japan in any number of places, but probably the best or the most concise description of it can be found in Marley Grayer Ryan's introduction to her translation of Futabate Shime's Ukigumo, or Drifting Clouds. So if you want to get that first story about the rise of the novel, if you want to get that in as few pages as possible, then that introduction is the best place to do it. With the work of Karatani Kojin in 1980, which was translated into English over a decade later, nature was added to these two topics of language and interiority. Genbun Ichi is crucial in Karatani's formation, in conceptualization of the novel, but Karatani reverses the priority of psychology and language in the traditional account, this one right here, to argue that the development of Genbun Ichi spurred writers into discovering interiority, to use his phrase. It also spurred writers into discovering a host of other things, including new landscapes unencumbered by the poetry of the past, so that the natural world is all at once an object of a character's vision and a topic of that character's thoughts, and sometimes even a kind of expressionistic projection of the character's interiority out into the world. Another way to state this is that in Karatani's story, the subject is brought into being through discovery of an object in the natural world. I should stress that Karatani's work has been much critiqued in Japan, especially by literature specialists, but I think it still has much to teach us. It was used by Komori Yoichi, among other people, to construct a kind of, I guess we might call it alternative lineage of modern fiction in Japan, one centered on nature, and as always we have to have three key figures. That seems to be the norm. I will later too. He will start out with Ivan Turgenev's stories about the Russian countryside and talk about how those were translated into Japanese by Futabate Shime, and then how Kunikida Doko was reading those translations of Turgenev and brought these techniques to maturity. And Kunikida Doko actually explicitly cites Futabate's translations of Turgenev in several of his works. There is yet a third lineage, championed by some critics, though it is a distinctly minority view, and this is my topic for today, literary sketching. I hasten to add that I'm by no means the first person to originate this idea. It goes back at least as far as the late 1980s with Eto Jun's work, Realism no Genryu, or kind of the sources of realism. The story, this particular story of modern literature then places emphasis on the adaptation of the European visual arts by Japanese writers, and the heroes of this third story of Japanese literature are poets, especially Masaoka Shiki, who wrote prose pieces too, but is probably best known for his reform, his rejuvenation of the tanka, the traditional poetic forms of the tanka and the haiku, the 31 and 17 syllable poems respectively. In this lineage, this third account, this third story, language is less important than visuality, and especially the way visuality is adopted into prose and how it creates possibilities for rich description. And I would say, I mentioned Eto Jun's argument, there are weaknesses in this book as well. One is that Eto has a very nationalistic agenda, as he often does, and one of the reasons he highlights literary sketching is to escape a framework of Western influence. But when we're dealing with the Meiji period, we cannot escape the framework of Western influence. So what I want to do is kind of recover the potential of this third lineage and look at literary sketching, but to look at a kind of transnational transmission of ideas across borders. So my talk today then will explore this third lineage. I'll add a European name to the list. This is John Ruskin, who, as far as I know, has never ever been discussed before in the context of Japanese fiction. And then I'll move on to Masaoka Shiki, and especially his reform of traditional poetics. And then finally I'll turn to the prose sketches of Shimazaki Toson, who is known primarily as a novelist, but in fact his career went through at least 3 phases. He started out as a poet, and a very good one too, moved to what we guess we would today probably call literary nonfiction, and then moved on to novels as well after that. So one thing I should highlight at the very beginning, I have no desire at all to pronounce these first 2 stories illegitimate. In fact, there's a lot of overlap between all 3 of these stories. For those who know these names, these on the right, you will see that all of these stories culminate in Japanese naturalism. So Japanese naturalism is clearly a key point, even though we normally think of the dates, the high water mark of the movement as being a mere 5-year period, 4 or 5 year period. 1906 to 1910 are the most typical dates given for the movement's most influential period. But so we're all essentially heading in the same direction, trying to figure out what naturalism is doing and how it transmits certain ideas about fiction, ideals about fiction, to sort of the next generation of writers. And of course, Genbunichi, psychology, the depiction of interiority, all of these things are important too. It just depends on how much emphasis you place on visuality or language or interiority. In the story I want to explore today, this story, this third thread, visuality, then will be the key emphasis. The word sketching in English, I think, indicates something that is preparatory or provisional, but actually a complex discourse about this developed in Japan. For writers and poets and painters, as I will talk about later, saw in it a universal principle of representation that could overcome the boundaries between the many arts. Now we'll go into detail later, as I mentioned, but sketching was discussed in Japan as a kind of meta-language of art, a technique that could bring together vision and language, and that had privileged access to the real, precisely because of its emphasis on visuality. But sketching also has other facets as well that I want to highlight, and especially I want to call attention to a domestic impasse in Japan that could be addressed by importing sketching into literature. By the 19th century, the Japanese poetic tradition had developed a highly codified classical language for depicting the natural world, focusing on a handful of objects and treating them in highly conventional, even formulaic ways by the time we get into the 1900s. Japanese writers in the Meiji era, and Meiji, for those who don't know, the dates are right up here. Japanese writers in the Meiji era borrowed primarily from 19th century European art in order to free themselves from the inheritance of the classical tradition. I think the best way to emphasize the local Japanese significance of sketching is to simply use the Japanese word for it, which I will do from here on out, shasei in Japanese, which literally means copying life. Writers will also use other words borrowed from English, including sketchi or study. But it's the technique of sketching from nature in order to capture as fully and realistically as possible in minute detail what one sees in the world. Shasei lies at the intersection of 2 larger literary concerns or discourses in the Meiji era, and I just hinted at this a moment ago, but the first of these is the emphasis on representing the world just as it is. This was a key term in the Meiji era. They even have a phrase for it, Ari no mama, or sometimes Ariga mama. Do I have it up here? Maybe, yes. The second one from the top. Second is the imperative of freeing the representation of nature from the hold of classical literature. Ari no Mama is best viewed as the translation into a Japanese literary context of the West's post-romantic ideals of realistic representation. A major goal of the advocates of this new verisimilitude was the creation of an objective narrative discourse that could dispassionately recount the events of the story as a way to overthrow the continuing influence of the didactic narratives of an earlier age. Part of this larger project, to return once more to a word I gave you before, is the creation of a new literary discourse, this is Genbun Ichi, as a counter to the classical rhetoric of early modern fiction and poetry, and to the moral perspective that adheres in that linguistic universe. So this is why language has traditionally been one of the privileged topics in the discussion of modern Japanese literature. The other literary current that I gave you then underscored the need to free Japanese literature from the hold of the past, and thus to open up new ways of seeing the landscape unencumbered by the millennium-long tradition of poetic composition. And this is why nature has become, in recent decades, a privileged topic of discussion when thinking about modern Japanese fiction. So what we have is an ideal of realistic representation of vernacular literary language and a fight against the weight of classical writing, forming a nexus for the emergence of literary sketching in Japan. If one tries to write about a landscape in classical Japanese, the privileged objects of the classical tradition and even the languages and rhythms of the classical language constitute a kind of involuntary memory that essentially structures, conditions how you're able to write about landscape. If, however, one can develop a new mode of writing, new modes of representation, and write about landscapes previously neglected by one's classical forebears using new methods of what at least is represented as absolute verisimilitude, one can then be free of the past and have something new. And I will come back towards the end of my talk today to this important question of the dream, or maybe we even should say hallucination or fantasy of unmediated contact with the real. But here I'll just note that by adopting and adapting sketching, Japanese writers were appropriating another mode of visualizing, experiencing, and representing landscape in order to displace inherited domestic modes. But, of course, when the Japanese writers displaced the domestic manner of writing landscape, they borrowed foreign models and the privileged objects within those foreign models. Today, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I'll concentrate on just one of those objects as a way to trace the movement of ideas across national borders, that is clouds. One way to, I guess, phrase this kind of battle between the old and the new is to say cherry blossoms are out and clouds are in. Clouds are all the rage at the turn of the century. The Japanese writers certainly did not escape the problem, the issue of representation, whatever they may have thought. But what matters to me here is the way sketching provided inspiration for Japanese writers, new subjects for them, and new tools for drawing a line between themselves and those who came before them, but also a technique that allowed them to make connections with the other arts. Sketching is often associated with prose narrative, but in the world of letters, it was not the novelist, but Masaoka Shiki, who pioneered the use of the new technique in his efforts to revitalize traditional poetic forms, such as the tanka and the haiku. For Shiki, the appeal of shase lay precisely in its ability to transcend boundaries between the arts. And Shiki himself dabbled in just about every form of writing that was imaginable in the Meiji period, and even towards the end of his life, in painting as well. We can go so far, I think, as to claim that shase was, for Shiki, the master technique held in common by all the arts. It is a meta-language of art precisely because it subordinated language to vision. Shiki borrowed the idea from his painter friend Nakamura Fusetsu and discovered that by transposing the practice into the world of poetry, allowed him to bleed residual traces of self-dramatization from his verse and to thus shift poetic practice from a lyrical expression of the poet's subjectivity toward an objective, microscopic descriptions of the natural world. Although Shiki has frequently been taken to task for coldly treating live objects as dead things, by Shimazaki Toson, among others, his pronouncements on Shasei suggest that his goal was actually something very, very different. The clearest expression, the clearest illustration of Shiki's ideals can be found in his short critical piece, Jojibun, which I have up here, descriptive prose, published in what was then the New Literary Journal of Hototogisu, the Kuku, in 3 short installments in 1900. This essay may just as well have been called Shasei, since Shiki uses them essentially as synonyms, Jojibun and Shasei, he uses them as, they mean the same thing for him. Admitting to borrowing the idea from the visual arts, Shiki defines Shasei as copying, this is actually a quote, do I have it up here? I don't have all the quotes up here. He describes it, quote, copying something just as it is in reality. His Japanese is jisai no ari no mama ni utsusu. Too much of the discussion about this piece has stressed the skepticism of the possibility of unmediated contact with the real, but I would actually emphasize that Shiki conceives Shasei as a vehicle for conveying emotion. And here I have a quote, this quote is right up here. When one sees a landscape, or even when one sees a landscape or an event that is captivating, one wants to convey this interest to a reader through words. Without embellishment or exaggeration, one must copy this phenomenon just as it is, here he uses ari no mama, and just as one sees it, mitaru mama. As Shiki makes clear, sketching is the technique par excellence for conveying to a reader the same emotion felt by the artist on viewing the object. Not in spite of, but because it opts for precise, detailed description, free of the subjective imprint of the writer. Embellishment for Shiki interferes with the transmission of beauty, yet Shasei in Shiki's hands is ultimately a vehicle of sentiment that creates a bond between the reader and the writer through the mutual appreciation of a beautiful object. The object directly observed by the artist must be represented and represented in words for the reader who did not see it firsthand, thus making language a supplement of vision. And here I use supplement in the strict deconstructive sense. It seems to be a handmaiden for it seems to be a handmaiden, and yet it actually is the most important thing. Furthermore, the object of Shiki's sketching was, with a few exceptions, the natural world, not the world of human society. And with sketching's emphasis on microscopic observation rather than the totality of a landscape, these imperatives imply the necessity of selecting details from nature. And here I have another quote to illustrate that. Selection implies choosing what is interesting and leaving out what is not. It does not necessarily imply choosing the large and throwing out the small, or favoring the long over the short. Shiki did not elaborate on his criteria for selection, but Mark Morris, in a really interesting essay, has argued quite persuasively, in my view, that the poet's subjective idea of beauty is Shiki's way of validating his selection of details. So it's just like taking a picture in a way. You take a picture, you think you have unmediated contact with the real, but in fact you can never escape the frame itself, and the frame forces you to select things out of nature. So that is the exact problem that Shiki is confronting, selecting details. What is important? You have to select, which means you emphasize some things and you leave out other things. And Mark Morris is arguing that what is left out, for what is selected, is Shiki's own subjective view of the beauty. The poet's personal experience of beauty would be captured by detailed, unembellished representation, illustrating how subjectivity infiltrates the technique despite Shiki's claims of objectivity. In his advocacy for giving preference to the trees over the forest, so to speak, Shiki ultimately argues for a narrowing and a focusing of the artist's gaze in order to see the fine grain of nature so as to best convey a subjectively experienced beauty to the absent reader. Shiki's ideas found currency among his friends and poetic disciples, most notably Takama Kyoshi, but the technique arguably had its greatest impact in the genre of prose. Influenced by the French painter Jean-François Millet, the the Japanese watercolorist Miyake Katsumi, and John Ruskin's influential book Modern Painters, the hero of which is the British landscape artist J.M.W. Turner. Shimazaki Toson appropriated the technique and recast it for prose. Still, Toson objected to aspects of Shiki's practice which he saw as excessively analytical, and instead advocated incorporating the human element and historical forces into the landscape being depicted. He wrote one book, Chikumagawa no Sketchi, or Chikuma River Sketches. It was published in 1912, but it's actually a collection of his sketches he wrote in rural Komoro around 1900. He was a country teacher in that area. And in this book, he actually does concentrate on the relationship between people and the natural world, the impact that people have on the natural world. But with this exception, really, Toson is interested in nature when he is developing this technique of chassé. And his object is no different from Shiki's. It's always objects in the natural world. In an essay simply titled Chassé from 1907, Toson discusses how he borrowed the technique of sketching from the world of painting. He refuses to acknowledge Shiki as a means, in his words, quote, to practice looking at things. He elaborates as follows, and here I have the quote up here. Like a painter looking at an object, one begins by observing a part of it. Trying to take in the object in its entirety is futile, and then proceeds to capture the truth of that object. So Toson's later critique of Shiki aside, this stance is actually quite similar to the poet's point that sketching involves making a choice about what to include and what to leave out, just like a camera lens. Toson simply emphasizes what is only implied by Shiki. Examining minute aspects of an object is part of a quest for a larger truth, although Toson neither here nor anywhere else ever elaborates on what exactly he means by truth. Like Shiki, Toson underscores the emotional connection created between reader and writer through the technique. He cites the French painter Millet by suggesting that the purpose of sketching is, and here I have, the passage is actually very long, so I just took two brief quotes and joined them together. The purpose of sketching is, quote, to move the human heart and, quote, to make another rejoice. Once again, by sketching an object one has directly observed and found captivating in minute detail, the technique becomes a vehicle for the transmission of sentiment to an absent reader, once again making language a servant or a supplement of vision. In this short essay on chassé, Toson mentions how he once created a homemade notebook and went outdoors to practice his art by observing the clouds at different times of the day and in different months. I've looked through a lot of his different writings, and I feel pretty sure that he's referring here to this very impressionistic essay called Kumo, or Clouds, a prose summary of the literary sketches he did while in Komoro as a country teacher, inspired as he was by Ruskin's discussion of clouds in his Modern Painters. And this is a book that Toson mentions by name at the outset of his essay. So Kumo or Clouds, was first published in the journal Tenshijin in 1900, and then found its way into one of his early anthologies called Rakubaishu, or a collection of fallen plum blossoms, in 1901. So this is, in other words, the point here is not to memorize the names of the journals, but to emphasize that he's writing at exactly the same time that Shiki is writing. They're all writing at the turn of the century, trying to borrow sketching, chassé, and incorporate it into the literary arts. Toson's interest in categorization is very much on display in this work, which includes lists and even charts, a kind of typology of clouds. He follows very closely Ruskin's division of the sky into 3 layers and the different kind of clouds that you have in each of those layers. The piece displays a sharp eye for detail in its descriptions of the shifting shape and color of the clouds and in the observations of the relations between the clouds and other parts of the sky or other parts of the landscape. And certainly nature's capacity to give us pleasure through its beauty comes across quite powerfully. And yet, even more than any of these, Toson emphasizes transformation, with change being among the most common motifs in the essay. And he states quite simply at one point, here I put it up, nature is always changing. Shizen wa tsuneni kawari ikeru naru. The artist's capacity to record minute changes within the natural world suggests that Tosson was drawn to sketching as a technique that helped him satisfy the demands of a rich, descriptive verisimilitude as he moved from poetry to prose, that is, in his terms, from romanticism to naturalism. That will sound very weird in a European context because those two movements are separated by such a large span of time, but in Japanese they washed ashore virtually simultaneously. It also suggests that the emphasis on microscopic observation was designed precisely to train the artist's eye to see the most subtle transformation in the landscape, thus linking the naturalist appropriation of Chasset later to that movement's interest in objective, scientific, as they would call it, description. The eye as a kind of microscope or camera lens. It is a tool for teaching people how to look anew at their world rather than through the eyes of their classical forebears and their highly codified poetic language. Interestingly, I hunted through the complete works of Shiki and found an essay called Kumo, or Clouds, there as well. So clearly this is a privileged object within discussions of Chasset. I think it's because, I still need to look into this a little bit more, but I think it's because of John Ruskin's very, very sensuous descriptions of the natural world and especially of clouds. It created an inspiration for Japanese writers. But I also think it's because clouds did not receive very much attention in classical poetry, so it can be spotlighted as something new. But it becomes a privileged object for those practicing Chasset and becomes embedded in a dense intertextual network by which borrowed ideas and methods were passed along across national borders and among the different artistic genres, from the visual arts to poetry, from poetry to what we would probably today call literary nonfiction, and then finally from literary nonfiction to the novel. In his sketch, Shiki creates a list of cloud types. He discusses the relations among clouds and other objects of the sky, and uses clouds as analogies for the season, all of which overlaps a great deal with the interests of Tosson's much longer essay. For our purposes, though, the most important aspect of Shiki's piece is the way he uses clouds to link nature as an ever-changing entity to sketching as a vehicle for creating sentiment. And so here is a quote I think that's especially relevant for the discussion today. Consider the clouds that appear overhead in the solitary valleys or underfoot in the distant mountains. These are dramatic vistas, so who would not be moved? But there may be few who would notice the clouds over the plains or in the clear blue sky. The clouds in a pristine sky also change, but it is undramatic and thus moves us only when our hearts are at peace. So to paraphrase, to kind of tease out what he's getting at in this very compact statement. Dramatic vistas in nature will be noticed and appreciated by anyone who would not notice a big thundercloud in the sky or something like that. Such things will be noticed by anyone. But the strength of sketching is that it disciplines the eye of the artist, allowing the writer to see the beauty of less dramatic elements, things that might escape the gaze of the casual observer. By extension, if sketching is a vehicle of sentiment, as Shiki claims in his critical essays, then we can see how the artist's trained eye, sensitive to the most minute changes in the natural world and conditioned to select out of the landscape the most salient and moving details, is able to compellingly represent and represent this unnoticed beauty to the absent reader. Relating this to the efforts to free literary discourse from the hold of the past, we might hypothesize that undramatic beauty, the kind of beauty that Shiki valorizes here and in other places, undramatic beauty corresponds to that beauty, the beauty of objects heretofore unnoticed in literary discourse, because the weight of the poetic tradition had conditioned the eye to simply see other things. The gaze, after all, is not ahistorical, but is deeply intertextual and changes with the historical context and its imperatives. And yet sketching, like so much pre-modern poetry, is generally centered on the representation of nature, with clouds being only the most prominent example. Nature was a privileged object of pre-modern poetry, and so it is a privileged object of modern literature as well. Clouds, which do not receive much attention in classical poetry, become a way to say something new, They become, for the modern writer, a privileged object within an already privileged world of nature. Lying at the intersection of Arte Nomama discourse and the imperative of freeing the natural world from the hold of the past, chasse is a technique for seeing the world anew, on the one hand, while concentrating the pen or brush on the task of capturing subtle changes within the natural world in order to create a like-minded community of readers who appreciate this heretofore unnoticed beauty, this heretofore unnoticed and neglected because of it. I want to turn next, and this will actually be the last paper I talk about today. I want to turn next to John Ruskin's writings, especially the way he discusses the representation of the sky in order to discover what it is that so captivated the imagination of writers like Schickie and Tolstoy. Oh, by the way, they were actually reading Ruskin too, so it's not just somebody I picked out of thin air. So they actually point you in Ruskin's direction. So doing this will suggest ways to put Japanese writings in dialogue with the Europeans, or at least here today with the writings of one influential Englishman. Ruskin's Modern Painters is a Herculean work of scholarship in 5 very, very imposing volumes. And I actually should probably confess here, although there's a camera, and I shouldn't do so, I'll confess that I've not yet read all of them. Each volume is about that thick, and there's 5 of them to get through. But at some point I will make my way through all of them. But I have read enough, I think, to figure out what the Japanese writers saw in Ruskin. First, I want to draw your attention to the centrality of clouds for Ruskin amidst all the other landscape elements in his painting. And here, I'll just pull a quote out. This also tells you how long this work is, because every time you quote something from it, it's volume something, part something, section something, chapter something. So, it's a long. We turn our eyes from the serene fields and skies of medieval art to the most characteristic examples of modern landscape. And I believe the first thing that will strike us, or that ought to strike us, is their cloudiness. That cloudiness is actually in italics. It's there in Ruskin too, so I just left it. But it does emphasize how important that object is. The reason for them is that Ruskin uses the sky, and especially clouds, as the benchmark separating modern landscape painting with everything that preceded it. Through the many hefty volumes, though the many hefty volumes of modern painters contain many illustrations of such cloudy skies, what I want to do here is actually suggest that the Japanese writers are less interested in the pictures, but they are drawn to clouds because of Ruskin's language. The language he uses is quite remarkable. It's very beautiful, so I brought an example for you. So this is just to kind of indicate the prose style that he develops in modern painters. If in our moments of utter idleness and insipidity, if you can use insipidity in everyday conversation, you'll be a better person than I am, because I can't find a way to use it. But if in our moments of utter idleness and insipidity, we turn to the skies as a last resource, which of its phenomena do we speak of? One says it has been wet, another it has been windy, and another it has been warm. Who saw the dance of the dead clouds when the sunlight left them last night and the west wind blew them before it like withered leaves? And this is just one example of this long kind of prose list that he creates. Who saw this? And then he goes into this very elaborate, very poetic description of the details of what he witnessed. But this will just at least give you a sense of how he describes things. It also, I think, gives you a sense of Ruskin's aesthetic. So it's not just clouds or landscape more generally that separates the ancients from the moderns. The moderns have trained us to see the fine grain of nature, things that are missed in our reliance on formulaic and banal observations, such as wet or windy or warm. And so even though I will not be discussing very many visual images here, let me just give you a sense, because I will be turning to Turner, just to give you a sense of what Ruskin is seeing in Turner. So one of the reasons Ruskin is preoccupied with clouds because he sees it in Turner. These are his sketches, not completed paintings. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. The hero of modern painters is the British landscape artist J.M.W. Turner. And I use the word hero here in reference to the place of Turner in Ruskin's history quite deliberately. Lest there be any doubt about Turner's importance for Ruskin, I'll give you a quote, one of several in the work. So it may be generally stated that Turner is the only painter, so far as I know, who has ever drawn the sky. Not the clear sky, which we before saw belonged exclusively to the religious schools, but the various forms and phenomena of the cloudy heavens, all previous artists having only represented it typically or partially, but he absolutely. He will also say things like, Turner, the first great landscape painter, must take a place in the history of nations. Turner, having first opened the study of the laws of material nature when before men had thought only of the aspect of human form. So keep in mind first that this is Ruskin's assessment of Turner's accomplishment, and Turner's place in Ruskin's story cannot be divorced from the ideological agenda of modern painters. This book rehearses in the visual arts the classic story of the battle between the ancients and the moderns, but what is so interesting from the perspective of Japanese studies is that clouds are crucial for Ruskin's agenda. The sky, and in particular the clouds, are the privileged objects of the book. The ancients placed clouds in the service of religious idealism rather than realism. The moderns, with Turner and the British leading the way, were able to free themselves and train their eye to see the fine grain of a mysterious nature and to show the immense variety there. This again is this is Ruskin's discussion of Turner. So it seems to me that Ruskin seeks in Turner a kind of quasi-spiritual quality that could function as a substitute for religion in an industrializing and urbanizing nation. But I'm not an expert on that, so perhaps if there's someone in the room, we can bring that up for discussion later. I have read one entire book on clouds in the European tradition, which is actually quite interesting. It's theoretically dense and very interesting, but it argues that Ruskin could use clouds to retain a sense of the mysterious, and this might help you see. This author, Hubert Damrich, argues that what Ruskin saw in Turner, what he was able to see is mystery. He was able to preserve the sense of mystery in the face of science's materialism, science's effort to kind of demystify the world and reveal how it really works. Ruskin saw in Turner a way to preserve mystery. To conclude my talk, passages such as this in Ruskin's book would have meshed well with the domestic discourse on arinomama, thus facilitating their transmission from England to Japan. The Japanese writers could easily draw from works such as modern painters, select ideals, and then link them to the imperative of depicting the world just as it is. Focusing on the trees rather than the forest, capturing subtle and subtly changing details in the natural world was an appealing agenda for Japanese writers. They firmly believed that sketching was putting them in contact with the real, rather than simply being another mode of representation. But we should take seriously their belief, and it is easy to understand their excitement when the adoption and adaptation of sketching was put in a historical context. The standard story of the development of the modern novel in Japan has long centered on language and a colloquial writing style. But focusing on literary sketching shows that placing the emphasis on vision might provide a new and productive framework, thus allowing us essentially to put Japanese literature in contact with international circulation of ideas, to put Japanese fiction in contact with the other arts as well, since they were discussing shasei as a kind of meta-language of art. All of these writers could read and compose classical Japanese, so they were acutely aware of language's codes and conventions. Indeed, for them, their classical forebears were simply manipulating linguistic conventions rather than looking at nature, producing these kind of endless variations on well-worn themes, even when they appeared to be writing about the natural world. So you can imagine that for the Meiji writer, their attitude would be something like, how many poems about cherry blossoms does one country really need? And so they're looking to separate themselves from that tradition, and clouds becomes a way to do that. Eventually, a couple of decades later, this naturalistic model of representing the world around us itself came to be seen as nothing more than a convention and even a mystification in which the writer foolishly thought that he was in touch with the real. Sketching would itself come under attack by the literary forces of modernism, which returned attention to language. Even we have a marvelous quote from Yoko Mitsubishi right in the 1920s saying, "What are you guys trying to accomplish?" These are the modernists, a war of utter rebellion against language. Nonetheless, at the turn of the last century, sketching provided a model of envisioning the world that must have appeared completely and thoroughly new. Thank you. As I mentioned, this is kind of the ideas I was exploring today was part just trying to figure out if a topic such as this is viable, if it leads to interesting things. I'd be very happy to get comments, feedback, even things like, no, that's not interesting, even that's a good comment, because then I can leave it at that and do something else. But I'd be very happy to get comments, suggestions, questions, anything like that.
Yeah, I have a question based on your discussion of the interpretation of Turner's clouds as like mystery. So I'm curious, what was the sort of goal of representing mystery? Is that something that the Japanese also wanted to do? Because it seems like the discussion of this sort of sketching in general would lead to you're trying to get outside of mystery and just talk about the thing itself. So is that something that
that's a really interesting question. So I actually don't know that much about Ruskin, so here I'll simply follow the work I cited before. So Demrish is arguing that the clouds represent sort of a last-ditch effort to escape the demystification of the natural world by science. Science's ability to seemingly describe and predict with perfection the way the natural world works. And that clouds, because their contours are fuzzy, simplistically put, clouds are this last-ditch effort to find something in the natural world that cannot be described by science. As it turns out, science is able to explain how clouds form and so on and so forth. But it's a last-ditch effort to find something in the natural world that retains mystery, retains something that cannot be reduced to the explanations of materialism. What I think, when Shibazaki Toson talks about truth, I think that was in the quotes. When he says what you want to do is capture the truth of the object, I think he has been seduced by Ruskin's discussion of mystery. So my guess is, he doesn't explain it, but my guess is he wants something that cannot be explained by natural law and things of this sort. So he's getting at something deeper out there. But there does seem to be a tension, as you're pointing out, between this interest in kind of objective scientific description and this desire to have some form of mystery left in the natural world. There's no simple answer to that. I would simply say the naturalist did not see that as a contradiction. kind of contest over cultural identity, essentially.
Okay, Tim, I hope you'll be patient with me as I try to put
Oh no,
this
is it like
together.
5 questions this time?
No, I don't even have, let's see if one comes out of this. So I know that you know very well the chapter I wrote on nature and colonialism. I'm probably part of that group that's, obsessed with the notion of nature in modern Japan.
For good reason.
Thank you, thank you.
For good reason.
And I'm thinking of, in your second row of people, right, Kunikita Dopo, was it? In the second, yeah. So I'm talking about his story, Sorachigawa no Kishibe on the shores of Sorachigawa in Hokkaido. And what strikes me is that there's no mention of clouds in that, but sky is important. And so I'm trying to inject back into what this group that you're talking about, the relationship between human beings and nature. And maybe what your answer is going to be is it's just not there. They're trying to, I don't know, I get confused. Like at some point in your talk, I felt like they're trying to privilege the artist who is the superior viewer of nature, like we somehow are better than the plebeians who don't know how to really look at nature. We have some kind of special talent. So there's some kind of even arrogant kind of self-aggrandizement there, which seems very much at odds with Dopo's discussion, kind of use of nature, which is to punctuate the impotence of man in the face of nature. How scary nature is in Hokkaido, and big skies just always bring back alienation to him. We are so small and tiny and so out of control, and we can really feel that when we're in these vast spaces that are, under these huge skies that just speak out to us the heartlessness of nature. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how your folks are thinking about the relationship between humans and nature.
There's, I can take a stab at it.
Okay, that's fine. Let's just have a conversation.
For the first thing, so you mentioned a kind of self-aggrandizement, which I think is a kind of elitism in a way, which is completely there in the writers I'm discussing today. There is something arrogant about claiming that we see, like all the other people, they use words like wet, it's warm, it's windy, but we poets and artists, we have 1,000-word sentences to describe this one thing we saw. But it is, what they are doing is, it's the artist sort of trains his, or in some cases her eye, to see the fine grain of nature. And then through a kind of seductive language, you represent that to a reader who is not there to see it. And you seduce that reader to your view of beauty. And by so doing that, you create a kind of community of of kindred spirits, like-minded people. And you can make a very good case that that community is an elitist community of literary people. I think a good argument can be made for that. So that part of your comments, I think I agree with completely. As I was looking at the way they talk about nature and how they're able to zoom in and see things that other people can't see, you get a real sense of kind of, we're special, definitely. The only way I can tackle the big question is to say, I would allow for multiple approaches to the natural world and towards the representation of the natural world, the representation of humanity's relationship with the natural world. My feeling is that these writers, so Tokutomi Roka would be another writer whose nature you feel is this gigantic thing that just dwarfs humanity. So humanity is reduced to something insignificant when immersed in this gigantic world of nature. I suspect the primary influence there is Christianity.
Yeah, and Turgenev, because I know Dopo
Turgenev as well, exactly.
Talks about him a lot, even.
So we know all of these people, actually Toson too, all these people kind of dip their toes in the water of Christianity, but Dopo, Roka, those people actually had Christianity had a far greater appeal to them, it seems to me, than somebody like Toson. And so Toson, this line, for me at least, are people who again, I try to avoid the use scientific because, as we talked about before, they're not interested in the materialism of science per se. They're interested. This is a nature that's in some ways the opposite. This is a nature where, so maybe the best way to phrase it, this is the nature where you focus on the forest, and the forest overwhelms humanity. Humanity is insignificant in this natural world. This is the line of representing nature where you walk into the forest, pick a leaf on a tree, and talk about it in detail. So by definition, in that sense, you can't have a representation of the natural world that overwhelms the human world. It creates quite the opposite sense of this kind of communion between the artist and whatever object he's looking at. So I guess my first inclination would be to say I would allow for multiple ways of approaching and representing nature by the writers.
And then to use your language of kind of framing, we're talking about a wide open
that'd be a
kind
great,
of frame.
right.
And think of that lens that goes open for Dobo,
Right.
and then for your line, it's just such a narrow kind of.
So this would be the the wide lens.
The
and
wide
this would be
lens, the wide
close-up.
shot. Yeah, exactly. Nice.
Yes.
So I studied Japanese art history in the medieval times. So art historically speaking, I think that we could see this move towards abinomama, the depiction of realism in nature. And I think that we see that movement, like the realism movement, as soon as almost the Kamakura period sculptures. And by the time we get to Edo period, we see painters like Ito Jakushu, who's 33
He's
Henry's
very famous these days.
are actually on display right now in DC.
Yeah.
So we see him like in his visual works that he was focused on this profoundly detailed observations of nature that he sees directly with his eyes, rather than like what the previous painters of the time did, which was to copy off of the paintings rather than from the nature. So these things were already happening before Japan opened up to the modernization, westernization. So do you think that this Western European influence was an acceleration factor instead of like a seed for this kind of development in literature?
I guess my answer would be very similar to the last one, in that there are multiple kinds of realism, and what matters is the enemy you're fighting against. So you can advocate anything, you can call it whatever you want, and we can translate it as realism or something like that, but you only get a sense, you can only discover what they really mean by that if you figure out who they're fighting against. Every artist is fighting against somebody to establish their own position. And so here, I think what they're using tools from outside in order to overthrow the codified poetic language. And they would say to get access to the real. So poetic language that they inherited and the artistic tradition they inherited, for them, is just language. It's just conventions. You're not in touch with anything real. Here, by stepping into the forest with your close-up, you do all these, they think we're in contact with the real. That for them is the primary thing. So they're fighting against a certain group. If you go back to the medieval era, you can describe what they're doing as some kind of realism, but there's multiple realisms, and they will be fighting against their own. They will have their own targets, their own enemies that they develop these techniques to use against. So these techniques are always used to define one's position differently from other people.
I don't know, it's kind of snobbishness about knowing the classics, if this is maybe something, this is out of an ancient classical
It's possible,
work or
yeah, that's
something,
also a
yeah.
possibility. What's definite is that something like Shashin, the scope of that word narrowed down to become essentially a translation of the photograph. And chassé, I don't know how long it existed before Shiki used it yet, but it did, whatever it's used before, it basically came to be the translation for sketching. Oh, I think there was a hand up back there first, but, so we'll come in.
I just had a question about Genbuichi and the trend towards more colloquial language, and I wanted to know if the writers, when they were talking about clouds or this leaf that they were really focusing on, if the form of Japanese was tended to be more colloquial when they were talking about these things than other aspects or maybe other writings that didn't have to do with this idea of, for example, clouds.
By the time they're writing, and by the time their chassé really makes some headway in discussions of the arts and becomes this kind of master trope for all the arts, this meta language of arts, that new literary language of Genbunichi is pretty solidified at that point. So you do have, of course, stylistically there are variations. Tayama Katai writes differently than Shimazaki Toson, who writes differently than other people. But that Genbunichi language has been pretty established by that point. So I guess at some level you can say something's more colloquial than something else, but really the important comparison here is a new language versus classical Japanese. And so whatever variations there are in Genbunichi, it's going to pale compared to the difference between all those and classical Japanese.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to know if there's, decidedly more specifically, a change in the form of language when discussing, the topics like this.
I would de-emphasize issues of colloquial language and emphasize elaborate, so this kind of very descriptive prose that becomes very beautiful when they write about clouds. So less about the colloquial and more about just the sheer descriptive power of the language.
So I guess from what I understand, chassé is about capturing the minute details of an object. But then how much, I guess for Shiki, how much of the author's kind of emotional reaction is added to that objectivity as something the viewer has to see as fact?
Shiki would say there's no subjectivity in here, but he's wrong. I think the best way to describe it would be that Shiki's most important goal is to do away with the lyrical voice. The lyrical voice that highlights the poetic speaker's subjectivity and the poetic speaker's subjective reaction to objects that he or she sees in the natural world, and to say this is objective description. But you can never escape choice. You can never escape the selection of details. Even if Shiki had a camera, as I talked about before, you still have the frame, and the frame makes you see some things and prevents you from seeing other things. So I don't think he would recognize that. He does say, you have to select details, but he would not see that. He would not see it as something subjective, as a kind of subjective imperative. He would say, well, duh, everybody knows that's beautiful, that's what I should write about. And then he would write about it in a way that he would represent as objective description. But no, you can never be like that. You always have to choose what you're going to describe, and whatever that choice is always going to implicate the artist's kind of subjective vision of beauty. But when you're creating a like-minded community of readers through representing this beauty, then you kind of seduce or entice another reader to see, oh yeah, that is beautiful. And then it becomes like objective. Like, of course it's beautiful, everybody can see that.